Nice to see you this morning. I hope you're enjoying a cup of coffee and some breakfast such as we have it here. I don't think there's any oatmeal out there, but there's stuff that's okay, and it should work out well. And we don't have any bacon, so we won't kill you all at once, which is good. Um, it's nice to see you this morning, and we're happy to have you participate in this forum event that the school is happy to put on. We're particularly pleased to have an event like this where we can connect the religious and theological traditions of this institution with current life and things of that sort. Think it's a good thing, and we're happy to do it. Reformed tradition's an old dog, but it still has a couple of tricks in it, and that's probably a good thing. I am here this morning to introduce our speaker. The Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Hinson Hasty is Professor of Theology and Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Charlotte. She received her PhD from Union Theological Seminary and Presbyterian School of Christian Education in Richmond, Virginia, which has subsequently morphed into Union Presbyterian Seminary in 2 locations. And she is also a graduate of Louisville Presbyterian Seminary and William Jewell College. Professor Hinson Hasty has taught at St. Andrews Presbyterian College and Bellarmine University. She has taught internationally, lectured internationally, and so forth, and is internationally known. She is the author of several books, including The Problem of Wealth, A Christian Response to a Culture of Affluence, that's Orbis 2017, and a forthcoming book, Authentic Christian Freedom, Deconstructing the American Gospel of Liberty, also with Orbis. This Saturday, in fact, she will be inaugurated as the occupant of the J. Roy Davis Family Chair of Theology and History at Union Presbyterian Seminary, which will be a great event in town for all Presbyterians and even some other people who aren't. This morning, she will be speaking to us on reformed visions of a just and sustainable economy. And you see the byline linking Calvin to Accra. So that will be a fair amount of territory. Elizabeth, we're very pleased to have you here.
I'm really honored to be here and grateful to enter into conversation with you, I hope, about linking Calvin to Accra. And I'll add a little disclaimer here. I'm going to connect this confession, Accra Confession, and Calvin from a theological perspective. I'm not going to do this from a historical perspective, but to think about the ideas, particularly in Accra Confession, in relation to some of the conversation yesterday. And I really enjoyed hearing Doug's talk on the Lord's Prayer as a social ethic, and also considering how Calvin's legacy is a grounding for a processus confessionis as a kind of form of prayer for a new vision of a just and sustainable global economy. At the moment at Union, I'm teaching a class called Theology 2. I know it's a title that probably needs some greater nuance, but some of the students who are taking that class, they're raising a lot of questions this semester about what they experience as 2 Christianities or competing Christianities in the United States today. When making this observation, what students are grappling with is ways to name competing Christian views that are part of the contemporary culture war. White Christian nationalists connect a particularly restrictive Christian identity to American public life and their vision for the common good, which insists upon religious freedom for conservative Christians, libertarian economic policies, and freedom from government control when it impedes or disrupts their privilege. At the same time, white Christian nationalists argue for limitations to be placed upon the freedoms of others: women, LGBTQIA identified persons, immigrants, people with disabilities, refugees, and more. White Christian nationalism is not synonymous with white evangelicalism, but cannot be understood apart from it. White liberal and moderate Christians speak out against this conservative vision as allies with solidarity protest movements and advocate politically for immigration and tax reform, gun control, reproductive justice, and advancing equal rights for LGBTQIA identified persons. Among Protestants, what's very interesting at the present moment is these competing Christian perspectives can claim similar roots in the theological tradition that emerged from the writings of the 16th century reformer John Calvin. And yet they argue for different social and political outcomes and interpretations of the meaning and the purpose of the church. What my students are trying to understand in this present moment is how such different visions of community and just and sustainable economy could originate from the writings and ideas of the same reformer and Reformation movement. Now, some scholars will suggest that John Calvin's social and moral vision gave rise to Trumpism. In January 2021, Richard Hughes, professor emeritus of religion at Pepperdine University, published an op-ed in the LA Times entitled "The Ferocious Last Gaps of the Religion of Christian America." Hughes aimed to explain Trump's ascendancy and look back 500 years to a young Protestant pastor who erected a theological foundation that in due time would help sustain a nation that the pastor could never envision, the United States. That pastor was John Calvin, whose theological convictions inspired the Puritans to embark on their errand into the wilderness. Ultimately, Hughes argues that Calvinism, as it has played out in the US, explicitly stands for Christian dominance and also implicitly promotes two other forms of culture and political power: whiteness and patriarchy. Other scholars highlight how theological concepts associated with Calvin's thought, such as God's sovereignty, covenant, predestination, and the elect, provide the intellectual scaffolding for settler colonialism, the conquest of indigenous peoples and lands, the transatlantic slave trade, and the Protestant work ethic. For example, historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz discusses the Calvinist cult of the covenant as the founding myth of the United States in her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Dunbar Ortiz writes, "The principal conduit of the Hebrew scriptures and covenant theology to European Christians was John Calvin, the French religious reformer whose teachings coincided with the advent of the European invasion and the colonization of Americas. The Puritans drew upon Calvinist ideology in founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as did Dutch Calvinist settlers of Cape Good Hope in the founding of their South African colony during the same period. In accord with the doctrine of predestination, Calvin taught that human free will did not exist. Certain individuals are called by God and are among the elect. The establishment of communities and their prosperity came to be seen as signs of God's blessing. The anxiety felt by Puritans and colonists to build a city on a hill within what they encountered and described as an untamed wilderness led to the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black people." Now, I want to be clear here that I don't want to explain away or dismiss the critical importance of analyzing, highlighting, and critiquing the role that Western Christian theology, and more specifically Reformed thought, has played in establishing racialized and gendered social hierarchies, colonization, conquest, and the enslavement of Black people. I agree with many aspects of these critiques, and I support the way in which they're deepening and transforming white Christian self-understanding at a critical time in our nation's history. Moreover, for me, I want to emphasize that this kind of critique is essential to Reformed practice and essential to what it means to be Reformed. Reformed Christianity is one of the few streams of Christianity, if not the only stream within Christianity, that insists on what is called the peccability or sinful nature of people and the institutions that we create, even the church itself. In Always Being Reformed, Faith for a Fragmented World, Reformed theologian Amy Plantinga-Paul says that critical practice has been one of the special tasks and privileges of the Reformed tradition. The church as the body of Christ on earth is a broken and diseased body, mirroring the ills and the divisions of the larger society. Critical practice counters the church's tendency to what Karl Barth called pious egocentricity. Paul observes that faithfulness sometimes requires resistance to established beliefs, policies, and the rituals of the visible church. This has been true for Reformed communities from their very beginning. For example, Calvin believed that human beings are prone to creating a factory of idols. And so he examined and re-examined practices of the church and the state, which would have been seen as coterminous at the time. So self-critical examination of Reformed theology and traditions is essential to the well-being of the church and its prophetic witness. I also want to suggest this morning that how we remember Calvin's story and his legacy is about more than just interrogating the past. The way we remember Reformed history can transform the identities and mission of Reformed churches in the present moment and for the future. So in this lecture, I want to invite us to think together about the Reformed tradition and competing Christian visions of the common good, and how the life and experiences of John Calvin leave a legacy for the confessional tradition as a form of prayer for a just and sustainable community, and also a prophetic church. I'll draw upon work being done by Reformed theologians in South Africa, and also recent historiography connecting 16th century movements of reform to the plight of refugees, in order to offer an alternative kind of view of Calvin's theology, his social and moral vision, and also his legacy. I'll reframe an exploration of the importance of Calvin's theological ideas and Reformed tradition as more than a tradition from the West that colonizes the rest, and consider how the forced migration of people across Europe during the 16th century Reformation introduced new visions for a just and sustainable community. Reformed Christian identity cannot be understood clearly apart from religious and ethnic persecution and forced migration. There's a richer and more textured approach that we can take to exploring John Calvin's theological writings by adding this layer of complexity and his experience as a refugee and exile himself that impacts competing claims made with regard to the identity of Calvinism today. I'll highlight John Calvin's identity as a refugee, his teachings on economics and usury, the investments made by the Reformation city of Geneva in social safety nets and public education, and his understanding of the vocation of the civil magistrate as resources for contemporary reform visions of a just and sustainable community and a prophetic church. And then I want to consider the importance of this reading of the history as the ground for a recent Reformed confessional statement that speaks directly to the church's witness to global economic justice and environmental sustainability, the Accra Confession, which I'll mention part of the importance of highlighting Accra in connection with Calvin is this is the 20th anniversary of the Accra Confession. So a confessional statement well worth celebrating. So I want to introduce you to a scholar here. His name is Robert Vosloo. He may have visited Davidson at some point. He's a wonderful theologian and also very influential in terms of beginning to emphasize the importance of not just a Reformed tradition, but also reforming the memory of what Reformed tradition is and how that impacts our understanding of Calvin's theology. And there's some obvious reasons why he wants to begin to consider and reconsider Reformed thought. He's also writing in the context of South Africa with a long history of apartheid, similar to what we've experienced in our own nation. He is professor of theology at University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, and emphasizes the importance of John Calvin's social location for his theology. Voesloo reminds us that Calvin was an exile, a refugee who experienced displacement and a longing for his native land. He ministered as a refugee to other refugees in cities like Basel, Strasbourg, and Geneva, but Geneva was really never his true home. The Reformation was an era of mass migration. While migration has been a consistent theme throughout history, the Canadian historian Nicholas Terpstra observes that the use of exile and expulsion as deliberate tools of state policy occurred for the first time 600 years ago. The political and economic realities that shaped these policies also spurred institutional religious reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Reformation then stands out as the first period in European and possibly global history where the religious refugee became a mass phenomenon. There was a drive to purify European communities and also purge them of ideas and people who did not fit with their dominant views of normality. This era continues to shape our understanding of peoples whose beliefs and also whose bodies are different, foreign, alien, strangers in our society, and not just in our body politic, but also in the body of Christ in Christian community. Thus, Reformed theological perspectives, the historical identity and mission of Reformed churches, cannot be clearly understood separate from this kind of migrant or refugee experience. In our contemporary era of mass deportation, revisiting the way Calvin's writings and ideas have been used in contrasting ways to, on the one hand, defend displacement and the predestination of certain social groups for prosperity, and then on the other hand, to support and create just and sustainable communities, is an essential task for Reformed ethics today. Voesloo argues that Calvin's experience as a refugee and exile shaped his theology, his ecclesiology, and his pastoral presence. Speaking out and being identified with Reformed ideas in the 16th century involved risk-taking. It also involved danger. For example, Calvin helped to write a speech for Nicholas Cop in 1533 that identified him as a Lutheran sympathizer, and he was forced to seek refuge in France. He spent 3 years as a refugee among refugees in Strasbourg, one of the chief cities of persecuted French people. There he pastored a congregation of 400 to 500 French refugees. The congregation became a model for the Reformed Church in Geneva, France, and elsewhere. There, Calvin discovered and began to write about the identity of the church as the persecuted and dispersed. He was invited to go to Geneva for a second time after he wrote a letter to Cardinal Sadoleto in response to the cardinal's call for Genevans to return to the Roman Catholic Church. Historian Janine Olson says that as powerful as his influence was there, Calvin was always considered a sojourner in a foreign land. Refugee life was part of the city's identity. In the 1550s, approximately 7,000 immigrants and refugees poured into Geneva, increasing the population by 70%. The population of the city had been something around 10,000. They were forced to confront xenophobia and tremendous need because refugees came with vastly different circumstances. There were struggles for power within the community. This context shaped Calvin's theology, his writing, his leadership regarding justice for people living in poverty and justice for people who were seeking refuge. The notions of asylum and the exile motif in the biblical text began to figure prominently in Calvin's writings, particularly in his writings on the Psalms. Calvin's identity as refugee challenges traditional interpretations of the doctrine of predestination and the elect. Instead of viewing the concept of predestination and election through the lens of the prosperous and the powerful, These ideas, in this context, reflect God's claim and solidarity with the marginalized, the persecuted, and the displaced peoples of the world. Vosloo says, the Calvinist doctrine of predestination is the mighty bulwark of the Christian faithful against the fear that they will be unable to hold on to against the pressure of persecution. Election is the gospel's encouragement to those who have faith, not a message of doom for those who lack it. It responds in particular to the anguish that Calvin already had felt in the earlier wave of persecution. Rather than providing grounds for arrogance, predestination offers all true Christians the hope that even under extreme distress, they will persevere till the end. Now, within this social context, Calvin also made a clear commitment to social welfare and did not view wealth as a form of God's blessing, but rather as a call to just and equitable distribution. He criticized the scandal of wealth inequalities and wrote in the Institutes, The Christian Religion, all of those arts whereby we acquire possessions and money at the expense of our neighbors are to be considered as thefts. Although those who behave in this way often win their case before the judge, yet God upholds them to be none other than thieves. For God sees intricate deceptions with which craft people set out to snare those of simpler mind. God sees the rigor of the exactions which the rich impose on the poor to crush them. Calvin's understanding of the abundance and the generosity of God was reflected in his teachings on usury and social welfare within the city of Geneva. Calvin and the other magisterial reformers, what they aimed to reclaim was the traditions of the earliest Christian communities. Early Christian leaders almost universally condemned usury. They developed a more distinctly Christian concept that in giving to the poor, one lends to God. Concerns about Gnosticism and the distinctiveness of Christian communities led to arguments among early Christian leaders that material things were not evil in themselves, but rather it was the inordinate love of an unchecked desire to accumulate things that was evil. Private property was justified when it was used for sharing. Some friends wrote to Calvin. They were seeking his advice on several occasions, and they were looking at matters related to politics, to theology, to economics, and also to church practice. One such letter was referenced in a National Synod of Virtual, which met in 1567, because of Calvin's comments on usury, or in the context of the letter, the charging of interest on borrowed money. Calvin's friend was apparently asking whether or not it should be permissible to allow the charging of interest at all. In response to his friend's question, Calvin recognized the danger of usury as he wrote, "If we permit usury, then some, under this guise, would be content to act with unbridled license, unable to abide by any limits." However, Calvin argued that there was no clear scriptural ban on usury. Rather, Christians should always proceed with caution when charging interest on money loaned to others, and that interest should be carefully restrained. The guidelines for usury were clear in Calvin's mind, and he urged those who could afford to loan money to others to lend to those from whom no hope of repayment is possible, as opposed to focusing on only considering loans where money will be kept safe. Calvin articulated 7 exceptions that must be considered when charging interest on borrowed money, and you can see those on this particular PowerPoint slide. Interest should never be charged to people living in poverty. Those who are able to lend money should not be so preoccupied with increasing their own wealth that they neglect their obligation to their neighbor or to people living in poverty. All lending should consider Jesus' own teachings about equity and the golden rule. The borrower should always make at least as much, if not more, than the amount borrowed. Lawful practices related to lending should not be determined by common practice, but the principles should be derived from Scripture. One should never just consider what is best for the individual, but must keep in mind the common good. And interest should never exceed what the laws of the country allow. In addition, Calvin noted his disapproval of anyone engaging in usury as his or her occupation. It strikes me in reviewing this list of teachings on usury that it also represents the kind of radical reversal that's part of the Lord's Prayer of forgiving of debts as we forgive debtors that we talked about yesterday. Historian Janine Olson also observes that early on in the city of Geneva, it focused on social welfare. And social welfare programs were really centralized in a general hospital that began in 1535 in a former convent of St. Clare. The welfare activities of Geneva were run by deacons during Calvin's lifetime. Calvin again looked back to the early church to define the role of deacons. And after investigating the early church, Calvin also found a place for women within the diaconate, as early Christian communities held the place for some mature widows for prayer and also for visitation of the sick. Deacons aided pastors with religious education and also helped to care for youth. They called attention to material needs of people in the city. They sought resources for charitable work, and they also distributed those resources and whatever else might aid the religious and moral life of the parish. Deacons also served as trustees and administrators of the city's hospital, which really was established to serve the indigenous poor and many refugees and immigrants who were seeking safe haven in Geneva. Over time, the responsibilities for refugees and immigrants were divided among different social groups. The hospital's budget was charged to care for people in poverty. It provided a home as well as bread for the hungry that was cooked in the hospital's ovens. Calvin maintained an interest in the hospital and later recognized the need for people in poverty to have a craft that would enable them to sustain their own lives and livelihood. So the silk industry was brought into the city. When needs overwhelmed the hospital because of these huge numbers of refugees that were pouring into Geneva, they found the funds to care for refugees coming at a time primarily from France, Italy, and Germany. And I want to make an observation here that I'll kind of test out with regard to these refugees, because in Europe, at least in my experience of visiting there and having lived there for several months at a time, there's also discrimination on the basis of ethnicity that you don't see quite in the same way in North America or in other contexts. And so these divisions of the refugees is an important reflection of also some kinds of forms of social discrimination. And so in attending to the needs of the refugees, there's a kind of broader or more expansive social vision here that I think is important to recognize in terms of what Calvin was doing. In the 16th century, poor relief had been historically designated primarily for local residents. The most common way for cities to deal with people who are coming from outside their own territory was by expulsion. Geneva, however, under Calvin's leadership, took on the responsibility to care for them instead of following the dominant practice. Now, one last observation I want to make about Calvin's teachings here that I think are very important in terms of our own context is that one of his main goals was to establish a system of government for Reformed churches and also for the city that would be driven by collective decisions. We love that as Presbyterians, right? Rather than decisions being driven by an individual's values or goals or by anyone's social privilege. Calvin argued for the legitimate and divinely ordained role of civil government to keep the peace, protect property, allow for public discourse, be both a safety net for basic need and a protector, preventing idolatry. Calvin also thought that civil authority was among the most sacred callings. The first concern of the civil magistrate, the leader of community, is piety and implementing laws that conform to the love commandment of Jesus and the golden rule. Very important to think about how he was viewing the importance of piety and conforming laws to the love commandment and Jesus and the golden rule. Now I'm going to do something that's very tragic, I think, for historians, and fast forward to 2004. But I want to, and I hope I've prepared the way to consider the importance of an alternative reading of Calvin for a confession like Acra at its 20th anniversary. If we situate Calvin's thought in his refugee experience, it invites us to think about the potential of Reformed theology and social witness to shape a radically different vision of just and sustainable communities than the vision that Calvinism has been connected to in recent months or years. In Reformed tradition, confessions are theological resources that serve as tools for effective moral and social critiques of society, and that can assist religious leaders and communities in creating transformative change. 2024 marked the 20th anniversary of the Acra Confession. The Acra Confession was adopted by the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, the predecessor of the Contemporary World Communion of Reformed Churches, to articulate the theological conviction that the environmental and economic injustices of today's global economy require the Reformed family to respond as a matter of faith in Jesus Christ. In order to create and adopt such a confession, ecumenical bodies and delegates enter into what is called a processus confessionis. It's a process through which different regions of the world and also different church bodies enter into to adopt theological statements, to enter into a process of prayer, to begin to fully articulate their convictions. The adoption of the Acra Confession took more than 20 years. Reformed theologian Jerry Pillay, who was a former president of WARC, he also teaches at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, says that the confession was intended as an excavation of social and ethical principles that are essential to Reformed witness concerning the nature and mission of Christianity in the midst of empire and the theological basis of human rights. Economic justice is named as the precondition to a secure, viable, humane order in society. When it was finally adopted in 2004, the meeting began with a delegation of church leaders gathering in Accra at the slave dungeons of Elmina and the Cape Coast, where bodies of millions of Africans were kidnapped, commodified, contained, sold, and subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage before being subjected to the brutality of the New World. They grappled with questions concerning how Reformed Christians in the past could ignore what was going on around them. The Acra Confession calls Reformed Christians to challenge a factory of idols. Remember that phrase from Calvin? It's always a call to reject practices of exploitation and oppression, and also to embrace God's new creation, to embrace Jesus' love commandment, and to embrace the golden rule. You see some of the phrases here that I've just simply pulled from the Acra Confession so that you can see the pattern of a call to embrace God's vision while at the same time reject death-dealing practices and exploitation. In the Acra Confession, it names neoliberalism as an ideology that claims to be without alternative, that demands an endless flow of sacrifices from the poor and creation. It makes the false promise that it can save the world through the creation of wealth and prosperity, claiming sovereignty over all life and demanding total allegiance. Since the 1980s, neoliberalism has set out to dismantle the welfare functions of the state. Under neoliberalism, the purpose of the economy is to maximize profits and return for the owners of production while excluding the majority of people and treating nature as a commodity. This global system protects the interests of the powerful. Whereas the Accra Confession, I think grounded in this alternative reading of Calvin, claims God is a God of justice, who calls us to stand with those who are victims of injustice. And I'm quoting here, "In a world of corruption, exploitation, and greed, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, the exploited, the wronged, and the abused. God calls for just relationships with all of creation." I find this alternative reading of Calvin and also the Accra Confession as an invitation to dialogue. So I want to lift up a couple of questions here and also invite your questions if there are thoughts it has stimulated for you. When I began my comments this morning, I mentioned that my students at Union are struggling with these competing Christianities, or two Christianities is the language they've used in class. And I wonder how we can speak into these competing claims about Calvin's legacy and differing moral and social visions for the common good. What are the resources we can draw upon together to do that? And also, what does the Reformed confessional tradition offer us as guidance in what we named yesterday as an age of religious confusion, the kind of confusion that we're experiencing? And I hope now to invite you into conversation or to respond to your questions.